Hey, welcome. I'm going to call this work session to order. Today is Friday, July 19th. We're here to discuss the APD body worn cameras policy, and it's draft 3.10.110 operational procedures, as well as AO 2024-69. Before we get started with the conversation, we'll do introductions, starting with Mr. Littlefield.
Mark Littlefield.
Karen Bronga.
Cameron Perez Verdio.
Anna Brawley.
Zach Johnson.
Christopher Constant. And then we also have on the phone Mr. Martinez.
Present, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera.
Present.
And on the right-hand side of the room, we have Chief Case, and we have Municipal Attorney Eva Gardner, and a small group in the room. So with that, I think we will start with the body-worn camera policy for the first half of the meeting, or as long as it takes. And I think that the plan today is to begin with a presentation on the policy by the chief, and then open the discussion to the room and or to the body. And I would just note, I'm told we have a new setup with the mics to do your best not to move them around, and that you should be able to talk into it from a normal distance and not have to worry. That might minimize some of the scraping and clunking sounds. We'll see. So with that, we'll pivot to
Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Mr. President.
I just wanted to clarify, because I was the one that asked you for this, at least the first half of the work session. And I think that the intention that, at least I'm hoping, I think I communicated this, was just to give an opportunity for both the municipal attorney and the chief of police to not only walk through the policy that is being proposed, but to provide a rationale as to why the changes are made, and to give us a real good sense of what that is prior to us having the conversation about the ordinance. So
Thank you. And I assume that is their plan. But thank you for requesting the work session. It is timely, because I believe once we're done here, the department will tell us their plan for implementation as well. So, Chief Case.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will try to go through this a little bit quickly, just because I want to get to the second half, where there's kind of a communication back and forth, and how we can make the policy as ready to finalize and move forward. The goal is on Monday, so we can start immediately with the new policy. So the logic behind changing the policy is our previous policy indicated that the chief of police could release the video up to the chief's discretion, and that kind of left the question: when, why, how, what was part of that decision-making process. And as of today, no chief of police has taken advantage of that. So obviously it's a statement in the policy that the public presume, which accurately so at this point in time, we probably are never going to take advantage of the chief's discretion in the policy. So the idea behind changing it is, let's give the public an expectation of when they can see body-worn camera footage being released after a critical incident. And if there is not going to be body-worn camera footage released, why? Like, what's the expectation from the public, that we will let them know as to why we're not releasing the footage? So that's the motivation behind the policy. We used LAPD's video release policy as a model. I understand that a couple of months ago that policy was shared with this body, and so since that was a policy that this body had seen, I just took that and used that as the starting kind of jump off point for changing our policy, and certainly open to feedback if we want to modify that. But I figured it's an easy conversation since we all read the same thing. So they have a 45-day critical incident release policy. We've adopted that, the same policy. In that 45 days, there's a couple of things that takes place. Generally, when there's an officer-involved shooting, you have one or two criminal investigations that's happening. You have one for sure, which is the conduct of the officer. And then if there is the person the officer shot at, it survives, and there are criminal charges on that person, there's two independent criminal cases going on at the same time. Once that portion is done, then the police department has the opportunity to do the administrative investigation, which can result in disciplinary action based on the conduct that's completely separate from the criminal investigation. So the idea of that 45 days is that the criminal portion and the administrative portion can at least be done enough to where we can get a statement from the officer. So the top priority as the chief with this policy is to make sure before we release video to the public that we have a documented statement from the officers involved in the incident prior to their viewing of the body worn camera footage. And if we back up probably a year ago or a little bit more, I know that the Public Safety Committee had a document that talked about body worn camera and when viewing is done. And so that was of pretty significant importance to this body in terms of when the viewing took place, in terms of providing a statement that surrounded the incidents. So that 45-day window allows that activity to take place. I mean, I can tell you, I would prefer that our release policy is much less than that. And maybe in the future it does become less than that. But I wanted to use a parameter that had a goal that I think that we could meet before we have a goal that we're just going to, not meet. And then I think that's a poor starting point. We added an additional thing that the draft policy that we took from LA did not have, which is a streamlined viewing process for the family. So this policy allows, after 14 days post-incident, the family can request a viewing of the video footage. And that doesn't mean that they're going to see it at the 14 days, but certainly a viewing prior to what a public release would be. That 14-day period allows us time to kind of gather the footage and put it together in a form that you can sit down and view. We're also adding context to that video. So like dispatch information, what information came into the dispatch center, what information was given from dispatch to the officers on scene. So instead of just a raw footage video that you watch and don't understand what information surrounded that, what the call for service was, we want to give context. And the way that the video information we put out is not the entire incident, the information we knew in hindsight. It's designed to show the information that the police department had going into the incident from that perspective, so the public has a little bit better understanding of the process that went through in the tactics for the decision to fire our weapons. So that's how the video is going to be produced. That video or that information that we're going to provide to the family or show the family will later be released to the public. So the family will get to see exactly what the public is going to see at the 45-day or before the 45-day, or when that decision is made. I think it's important to note that a good defensible policy really makes the decision based on a practical standard like the 45-day and puts in exceptions as to why we would go outside the 45-day. And I think it's just important to note that we have families of people that are involved in this incident. So, if an officer is involved in a shooting and the individual that's deceased, their families, and the policy doesn't allow for the family to make the decision on whether or not there is a public release or not, that becomes challenging, I think, for the public, although I have a lot of sympathy for that position. But it provides no direction for the public. If every officer involved shooting we have, it comes up to a family member. It also creates a challenge if you have multiple family members and some don't want the release and some do want the release. So the policy is written from the standpoint that it is a consistent policy that will be handled no matter what the family members of the individual that was shot, kind of what they want in the process. So that's the general idea of in the main highlights of the policy as it stands now. I guess I'll take questions and then maybe link up what the resolution is and how that looks compared to the policy.
Thanks, Cameron.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate you being here. I just want a couple of questions. The 45 days. Well, my understanding is what you said is that it's primarily around time for the to gather the statement and ensuring that is done. What is the where did the 45 days come from? What was the rationale for Los Angeles? I guess I'm trying to understand, using that as a standard. Was there a rationale for how long that typically takes? Was there any research done to give us a sense of why that's the appropriate amount of time or not?
So in the state of California, there's some legislative action that took place as to that led to those timelines that impacts the entire state, not just the city of Los Angeles. So I don't know the rationale that went behind that or the logic. We simply just chose to use that model as an example, as a starting point. And like I said, I think in the future that may change depending upon how this looks.
So we don't have any information at this point about how long that typically takes here in Anchorage.
It depends.
Okay.
So for instance, depending on how busy either the homicide team is with the police department, or that Office of Special Prosecution, how long it takes for them to get the information from us, and then how busy they are to process that and determine whether or not they're going to move forward with indicting an officer or decline a case. I mean, there's, that impacts it.
Okay. And just one other question, and then I'll cede the floor. You mentioned the production of the video, and I think part of the public concern that I've heard is if part of the reason to release the video is to be transparent and to ensure that the public sees what happened. If there is a process of producing it, how do we ensure that we're actually seeing the whole story? That's, I guess, a question that I've heard several times. How do we know that what you're producing is an accurate representation of what actually happened?
So we have a lot of models from around the country where police departments have produced videos that for their officer-involved shootings. And so I think if we look around the country on what those videos look like, what we see generally is kind of a start to finish production of what that incident is like. And then it's our responsibility when we put the video out so that it's very clear. So when we say we're producing a video, what we're not doing is modifying the videos themselves. What we're doing is we're taking and piecing together various different angles so that you can see the incident from multiple angles, multiple perspectives. Different cameras have, things that are heard in terms of the audio. So putting those cameras together so that it's a start to finish. The first video that we've produced, we have just under 100 hours invested in just producing that video. And so releasing 10 or 11 body cam videos without any context whatsoever, cold. I mean, that's challenging, right? Like, what do these videos mean? What perspective are they shot from?
Right.
What do those officers know on the video? The raw footage creates, now you just have a bunch of data points out there and not a story. And I think after we see the first one that's released, I feel pretty confident that we're going to get feedback. We're going to get feedback from the public. We're going to get feedback from the family. And the goal is to show the most clear and accurate picture of what happened. And we'll kind of go and see what the public thinks after the first release.
Okay. I do have a slight, is there a third party involved at all in the creation and public or producing of that, or is it solely within APD? Is someone from the legal department involved? Is anyone else involved in the actual production of it beyond APD?
We did it in-house.
Okay, thanks.
All right, I've got a cue. Zach, Mr. Johnson.
Yeah, thank you. Can you just explain, either yourself or Ms. Gardner, what would the harm be if it was mandated, dictated that the department release the footage within, say, a week or 2 weeks after an officer-involved shooting? What would the consequence of that be?
So there are a few competing.
I don't think it's picking you up. I'm really strong pro replace the mics team.
Is this any better?
Yeah, that is. I can
Okay.
hear you now. Thanks.
So there are a number of things that have to be balanced in this consideration. So one is protecting an investigation, which I'll talk about more. One is privacy of people involved, in particular witnesses. One is constitutional and due process rights. Another is the one that we're talking about here is public accountability, and another one is sensitivity to the families who may have suffered a loss in this process. And so, as a practical matter, it would be based on conversations with Chief Case and the Office of Special Prosecutions, and also just awareness of some of the other factors that go in. It would be really difficult to balance all of those responsibly in a week or 10 days. So the 45 days, as a practical matter, is a realistic time frame to identify all the witnesses so that you can make sure if they appear in a frame, you can blur out their faces, right? You can figure out which frames they're in, blur out their faces. You can notify them prior to release if they're going to be appearing in something. You can get statements from all people involved, in particular the involved officers and the witness officers, to make sure that those are part of the investigation before the footage gets publicly released, which puts different pressures on the people giving the statements. You can review, as Chief Case mentioned, the potentially huge voluminous amount of footage, which is not a small task. So reviewing potentially 11 different cameras or 20 different cameras and balancing those the privacy concerns and all of that does take time. And also, it gives a quick but realistic time frame for the Office of Special Prosecution to complete its investigation and decide if it's going to bring charges or not. And if you put it at 7 days or 10 days or 14 days, there's no way that process is going to be complete. But 45 days gives them a target that they might be able to meet. And then you can proceed without any concerns about compromising an investigation. So the Office of Special Prosecutions held a press conference 2 days ago. I don't know if the Assembly members have watched it, but it was almost an hour long. And John Skidmore, who's the Deputy AG of the Criminal Section, I might have the words wrong on that, but he gave a detailed presentation explaining all of the explaining the OSP process for investigating officer-involved shootings, as well as the concerns about premature release of footage and the ways that that can compromise an individual's constitutional rights and compromise the ability to have somebody stand trial for something when they really should. So with that.
Follow up to that, and I'll have to go watch that press conference, but could you briefly talk about, just elaborate a little bit, because, accountability is important, right? And accountability often means successfully prosecuting people when there's evidence that they committed a crime, whether it's the suspect in the case or an officer who misuses force. You say that releasing the footage before the investigation is complete could be harmful to that. Could you just briefly explain why that is?
Yes. So releasing, one significant concern is that releasing evidence predisposes, gets a lot of media coverage, predisposes the public toward one way or another, right? They've seen the footage, they've preformed their conclusions, and then you have to pull your jury for any potential criminal trial from, this community, right? Part of your constitutional right, if you're charged with a crime, is to stand trial in front of a jury of your peers. And there is prosecutors and defense attorneys and people in that world are always concerned about tainting the jury pool, because you don't want somebody to stand up in front of a jury that already has made up its mind before they even walked in the courtroom. Or in some circumstances, in small communities, and Anchorage is still a pretty small community compared to somewhere like LA or Chicago, is a pretty small community, and you might not be able to find a full jury of people who haven't seen the video and potentially already made up their minds. And then you're talking about removing the case to a different jurisdiction where the makeup is different, and then you are no longer standing trial in front of a jury of your peers. So there is that concern.
Okay, thank you. And then last little follow-up piece, and then I'll yield the floor. But just to make sure I'm following this correctly, what this seems to suggest is, sorry, Thunderbirds are being rather loud in the background, that we could potentially have a hypothetical scenario wherein we find an officer used force that was not justified. They are being investigated for a homicide. The determination is made that they should be charged with homicide. And if the footage is out there before that investigation is complete, before the determination is made, it may increase the likelihood of, in this case, somebody committing a murder and not being successfully prosecuted for it. Is that a fair conclusion?
That is a possibility, and that is a concern, and that's the concern the Office of Special Prosecutions has voiced.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I have myself in the queue then. Mr. Rivera, Mr. Salt, and Ms. Brawley. Mr. Salt joined us for the record at 10:27 a.m. So I would note that we did receive an outreach from Mr. Skidmore at the Office of Special Prosecutions, and he was invited to participate. And they had their own press release, and I did not hear back from them. So just want folks to know that they were provided an opportunity to come here today and chose not to exercise that opportunity. So I, generally speaking, am supportive of the policy, but there's one section that I raise as a question for you, and it's on page 5. It's section F1C. And I think that this one could use a little more definition in the final, because when I read it, it says all imagery may not be released. For example, all shots fired or moments immediately following shots fired may not be released. I think getting to the point of the production and who's producing and is it creating a narrative that maybe not what was factual is a fear. And so I think that what I would appreciate to be added to this section is some caveat that states that does not change the perception, or that it does not create, something along the lines of all shots fired that are duplicates or substantially similar, so as not to change the perception. I don't know how you could word that, but that section I think is the one that I would love to have a little more caveated in, that is all shots fired may not be released if they don't change the outcome. I don't know what the language could be, but that would be my thing that I would like to see slightly amended there. And I would just, I believe, this argument, which is not irrational, that it may not change substantially or it may taint the jury pool or some other elements that come forward. It's valid, but there are all of those interests to be balanced that are on the list that we've talked about: the family, the privacy, the public's right to know, the accountability, all of those things. And I would have appreciated the Office of Special Prosecutions being here, because in the reporting on their efforts, there have been 9 officer-involved shootings statewide since late last year, and only one of them has been cleared, right? And so if we have to wait for an office that's taking 7, 8, 9, 10 months, 2 years to go through the process, then it certainly infringes on our duty to provide to the public. And so I don't know that there's a question there, but I think that this process, this policy will maybe light a fire under the OSP to be more time sensitive in their efforts to do these investigations. Any thoughts on that, Ms. Gardner?
Yes, thank you. So of course, we have no control over OSP, but I think the public attention on this and the advocacy on this issue has lit a fire under them. So they issued a press release accompanying their hour-long press conference on Wednesday that gave an itemization of all the officer-involved shootings that they're still investigating, with an update on what they're still missing. And in the press conference, they also explained they acknowledge that the timelines they've been operating under are unacceptable, and they expressed a very strong commitment to working with the state agencies that are creating delay, including ballistics, including the state medical examiner, to speed up those timelines. And of course, those are words at this point, but we are optimistic that the public attention on this will speed them up. And I think our hope is that the 45-day deadline in here for release will operate as a deadline for them to complete their investigation. So they have publicly expressed a commitment to speeding things up.
Which, and it's if that in fact proves to be true, is a great outcome of this process, because it will provide broadly for the state, even not just Anchorage, a closer kind of line in time from action to decision. So thank you for that input. Next in the queue, I have Mr. Rivera.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So a few questions from me. First is, I appreciate Chief Case's wish that the timeline was shorter than 45 days. I agree with him on that perspective, and also wish we could do shorter than 45 days. I'm hearing this phrase a few times of "in the future." So I'm wondering, and this could be a question that either the municipal attorney or the chief can answer, what kind of criteria are you going to look for to reduce 45 days to some lesser amount of time that would be, I think, more truly respond to the public concerns that we need to release this footage faster? So what criteria are you going to be looking for to make that determination?
So I think some of the things that we want to look at is right now, it's kind of the standard is if the Office of Special Prosecution is not going to move forward with prosecuting an officer, they issue a declination letter declining charges. And that's kind of the end of their portion. And the Office of Special Prosecution is involved in the process pretty much from day one. So they get it's not like they're waiting for weeks and they know nothing about the case whatsoever. And so I think there's a potential that even prior to a declination letter, that there's enough information out there to know whether or not we're moving forward or they're moving forward to either prosecute or not prosecute an officer that potentially could allow for earlier release. But that's something that we're going to have to work through in future incidents to see if that is an actual possibility.
Mr. Rivera.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, it sounds like one particular office that we have no control over keeps getting mentioned in this work session. So it's quite frustrating to me that we're being hamstrung by that agency. So next is, I appreciate that the streamlined process for private family viewing requests was included in here. I'm just wondering, in terms of the creation of this particular section, were victim-centered best practices used in the creation? Can you just talk a little bit about how you got to this particular creation of the family viewing?
Can you point to the number in line, or at least the section number?
F4.
Yeah, so I'm talking about page 8, at least on the PDF, and number 4.
Thanks. F4.
So I think the private family viewing, obviously the importance to this is, you have a family that's grieving, and then they see on the news or posted, on our website, and that's the first opportunity they have to take in that information with the rest of the public. And then, now there's not time where they can view this video and they can kind of process this with their family. That's why we wanted the much earlier possibility for them to view. So theoretically, we should have videos ready to go for them at the 14-day point. So when they make that request, we can respond pretty quickly after that point to allow them to see the video, and then they get that additional processing time. They can make sure that they have family members that are available to watch it in coordinated time, so they're not rushed to do it immediately after they make the request. So there's some flexibility that's built in there. There's also what we're looking at and how this rolls out, but we're certainly thinking about this is offering, right now, chaplain services, right? The police department has access to chaplain services, but there's a mental health component to this as well. Whether the municipality, offers a chaplain to be there if they want, or they want to bring somebody that has that mental health component is a big piece of this as well. So again, that they're not just watching this without somebody that is trained to provide some support with them as well. So we're trying to create that environment as well as the location. So where this viewing is, it's probably for most people not the most comfortable place to go to the police station and watch the video, to have some offsite location. So that's also a piece in the viewing. So for moving forward with the policy, those systems will be in place because we got a 45-day buffer here. When we talk about the officer involved shootings that we already have, we're gonna piece this together as best we can. It's gonna be better and more clear moving forward.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it sounds like you've put a lot of thought into that, and I appreciate that. Maybe you have, but if you haven't, I would definitely suggest, just to make sure that we're very careful in this particular section, that perhaps APD reach out to victim advocate organizations just to get their feedback on that particular section. And then the last question, just really quickly, I had was, and this actually goes to a little bit of what the chair and I think Member Perez Verdillo were trying to get at. So is there, and maybe this is a question for the municipal attorney, is there an opportunity to have attached to the video some type of redaction summary similar to what we get for other documents that are redacted? We get a line by line, this is what, why this redaction happened. Is that something that could be attached to these, just so that the public is aware maybe why certain things aren't shown, why certain faces are blurred? Because I think that would offer maybe a little bit more transparency and understanding for the public.
Ms. Gardner.
Thank you. So on that particular question, I'm actually going to defer to Chief Case because that is a practical question for their video production process. But if I may, I'd like to address your earlier question about the victim-centered approach. And I'd like to point out that this, right, it's a draft policy. It's a policy that is going to be put into practice and tried out. And if you look around the country, nobody has figured out a perfect way to deal with this, a perfect way to balance the tensions. When a member of the media asked a question at the OSP press conference on Wednesday saying, well, in Chicago, they do this. I pulled up the Chicago policy, and it says, we're going to see how this goes. And in a year, we're going to revisit it. And every year, we're going to revisit it and see. So I think that please keep that in mind. This is a new area of policymaking for police departments nationwide, and other jurisdictions are doing similar things, different things, but nobody has yet figured out the perfect way. So the streamlined process for private family viewing requests, it is a suggestion, it is an idea, it is something that is going to be implemented, but it is not fully figured out yet in every detail of exactly how it is going to be implemented in a practical sense. And the mayor's office has asked to be directly involved in helping coordinate the actual family viewings for at least for a while, to try to make them victim-centered and to make sure that that families feel supported when they come to view this very, very difficult footage. But I will give the rest of the actual question back to Chief Case on the possibility of having a redaction statement.
I'm not sure I want to commit to every single redaction, because there are a lot of redactions that happen in these videos when you have 20 or 30 minute. In a lot of the redactions, you can see there's blurring of faces, there's blurring of license plates, or like a dispatch call, you'll hear the person verify their address, and then that will be blanked out so that we're not putting people's addresses. So a lot of it's going to be relatively obvious. And so I think, maybe a blanket where we talk about some of the things that addresses are going to be blanked out, dates of birth, social security numbers, identifying stuff, so that when the public views the video, they don't go directly to a witness's house and knock on the door, because that was in the video. A statement that, we had witnesses that were viewing the incident weren't directly involved, and those faces are blanked out. So I think we can provide a reasonable explanation that's specific to each one of these incidents, so that there's kind of a global understanding of some of the redactions that have taken place. Most of them are legal redactions that we're required to do, so that we're not allowing information to get out, personal information to get out.
Okay, thank you.
So a redaction summary rather than a redaction log.
Correct. Yes, sir.
Right. So next, Mr. Salt.
Thank you. For Chief Case, I appreciate the policy and I'm largely in line with it. My question is around the same section. So with an officer involved shooting, there's two parties here. So are we affording the same ability to view the footage for the officer or for the family should the officer be fatally shot in the same interaction?
Yeah, great question. So the officers involved and their families are afforded the same opportunity to see the video before it goes out. In the first video or two that we put out, we're also going to make it more widely available inside the organization as well, so that the department has an understanding of what these videos look like. That portion will probably eliminate as we move forward, but for the first couple at least, that that kind of reduces the anxiety of what does this look like, and they don't have to view it for the first time as well. Because remember that we have witness officers too that were a part of the incident, and so they've got some trauma that's also built in as well, and so yeah, both of those opportunities are going to be afforded to the families as well as the officers and their families.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Brawley.
Thanks. I have a couple questions that may need follow-up afterwards, but I just want to ask them now. One is, we've talked about the Office of Special Prosecutions. I think others have flagged that they seem to be the bottleneck, for better or worse. And I know that that's not something we can change in terms of their role, probably, but I guess I'm asking if there's anything that APD is aware of, or Department of Law at this point, where maybe we need to go to the state and ask for changes. And I'm thinking of speaking with Alaska Municipal League and other local governments, because of course there was an individual shot in Juneau recently. There was one in Kasilof by state troopers, right? This is not just an Anchorage issue. And I imagine that all of those are going to end up at the OSP. So that's a question for now, if there's anything policy-wise that we should be advocating for. And then in general, that's a follow-up that I'd like to have after the meeting as well. A couple of
So I'm going to jump on that one, if I might. I think that that's a policy question of the assembly, whether or not the policy we have and the bottlenecks that we experience are in need of going to Juneau. I think that the police chief or the municipal attorney could opine, but I think that's a better conversation between the members, the mayor, kind of where we want to go. So I don't want to put my foot on the question, but it's hard to put these two into the position of should we advocate for legislative change.
Yeah, thanks. And I appreciate that. And I guess I raise it because we're going to need to look to Department of Law and APD to at least point to what some of those friction points are. But I appreciate that it's a hard question to answer. I don't know if folks want to respond at all.
Given that OSP has said that they are making some changes and they are putting their own pressure on the internal state agencies, and I failed to mention earlier that they also announced they are doubling the number of prosecutors who are assigned to these cases. So it used to be 3 and now it's 6. So I think that it might be a good idea to let that play out and give them a chance to make things move faster, and then we could have this conversation again later.
Thanks for that. And the next question in the policy, I guess I'm just trying to play out scenarios. I think that's what we've been doing in various ways. One of them is family makes a request. They get to view the footage according to this policy. And I see that they're supposed to essentially agree to not disclose any of the content ahead of time, whether it's recording or speaking to the press. I can also imagine a very reasonable scenario where a family member views the footage, is very angry by what they see, right? Even in the context, walks out of that room and then goes in and speaks with the press or speaks with someone else and basically breaks that agreement. So I just wonder, because I'm not suggesting that that is what they should do, right? Because that's part of this. And the idea, I believe, is that the footage is eventually released publicly. But what I'm wondering is, then I guess what would happen next, or at least how do we plan for that? Because I would not also want it to turn into basically the family, that member or the rest of the family be, further complicating things. So, so I just wonder kind of if that's at least been contemplated, and kind of what might happen next, because I think we do need to address that situation.
I'll pass the mic to Chief Case after I give my answer, but that is a situation we hope does not happen. And I know it's not a satisfying answer, but everything, there is a desire and a need to protect the investigative process, but there's also, a desire and a need to let the families have access to this footage and let them have some degree of answers and visibility into what happened before everything becomes public. And Chief Case and APD made the decision to accept the risk that somebody might go out and talk about it later. And we have not to date discussed in detail what would happen next if that happens. And I'm going to pass the mic to him, but no, we haven't mapped that out because it's a situation we hope does not happen. And again, it's a risk that Chief Case has decided is worth taking.
So I think if this was a practice that we saw regularly where the family was kind of violating this agreement, one such solution is that we then push the family viewing closer to the public viewing, or the public viewing is pushed out a day or two, so that even if they do go to the press, the concern, the investigative process would have been protected, which, I mean, obviously the downside of that is 45 days may turn into 47 or 48 days. But again, I hope that doesn't happen, and we're willing to try this out. And before we want to create that space, right? We want to create that time, and we don't want to lengthen the 45 days. So I feel comfortable moving forward with this, that we'll be able to manage it.
Yeah, and I just want to be clear, I'm not asking this because I don't agree that the family should have access to this. I think they should. I just want to make sure that we've thought about that. And again, that there is not then an immediate, retaliation or some kind of other negative impact on the family, recognizing that if they signed something and said they wouldn't do it, and then they did break that agreement. But in the circumstance, and given that these will be very emotional situations, it's reasonable to expect that that'll happen at some point. So, and then I had one more question, but it sounds like you wanted to respond.
To that end, and that is why to manage that risk while still paying respect to the family situation, that is why the policy doesn't give the footage to the families, which I know is something that has been raised in other proposals. So that it's a way to manage that risk at a level that the APD thinks is reasonable at this point in time.
And then my last question, just thinking about, we talked a lot about the production and kind of what people might expect to see in this footage and what could be redacted. And I'm not remembering if there was an example, whether it was a staged example or just cut together from some actual footage that was collected already that's been made public, not from any of these shooting situations, but just in general. And I just wonder, is there a way that APD could produce that, whether it's taking, maybe an incident that is lower level, right, and still has redactions, but doesn't disclose the most sensitive kind of situations that police encounter, or is it maybe even a staged event, basically, where it's scripted and somebody is walking through and speaking on the camera, like, this is what we're doing, and this piece will be redacted, right? It's almost a meta video. I just wonder because I don't think we've seen any of this footage, and so I'm just thinking about the reality that if the first set of footage, significant footage from these body-worn cameras is one of these incidents being released, I think then people will draw a lot of conclusions from that and maybe read more into it than, or I shouldn't characterize it that way, but I just wonder if there's a way to give an example up front so that people have, again, a visual expectation of what they're going to see on body cameras, and maybe that's a way to explain some of the more common redactions, like you said, license plates, so that people know what they're looking for, and then we'll end up keying in on what's unique about that situation in the footage versus something that's incidental, like having to blur license plates. So I don't know if that's been discussed or if that's something that could be produced relatively quickly.
That actually hasn't been discussed, but a good point and a good suggestion. I will say that we are probably going to end up releasing one or two of our videos before we produce that, because I don't want to delay the release of the video, but I think that's something that we could probably produce that would be helpful for some people. So good.
Thanks. Yeah, and I'll just say, I'm again not asking because that should come before these actual incidents being released, but I think it would be a helpful piece of communication alongside those things.
So we are swiftly running out of time. We have a second part of this conversation. I'm not going to move us to that part of the conversation at this time, but I am going to reserve the last 5 minutes for one of the sponsors to kind of walk through the AM relating to the ordinance. And I'm going to roll through for the folks who haven't yet spoken. And then I have a couple who have already spoken who wish to speak again, but just recognize there are at least 4 people right now in the queue to speak on this. And we have approximately 6 minutes before we have to pivot. So Mr. Volland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I want to acknowledge that I appreciate the efforts that have been made to have the policies publicly available. After George Floyd was killed, there was a press release that former Chief Dahl did with former Mayor Berkowitz, and they talked about how the procedures and policies are a living document, and they can be changed weekly or even daily. And as part of that press release, they were talking about how they were going to be banning chokeholds or putting some parameters around chokeholds. And so at the time, this is well before I was elected to this body, I thought, well, then what is to prevent them from unbanning them tomorrow? And so, I appreciate the work that has been put into this policy, but I guess this policy is subject to be changed and updated. And so I guess I would like the public to be able to track those policy changes. So if, let's say, there's a change to the body worn camera policy, when I go online to the procedures manual, will any change have the new date and say, it replaces prior policy of the previous iteration?
Yes, every time we update a policy, the former policy date will be there and then the new policy date. So you'll be able to see that it could change this next year.
And then for the public to track those changes, how do they do that? Is there will there be a publicly available archive of the former policies? How, I guess let's say we in the future go from 45 days to 60 days. Is that something that can just kind of be put in? How does the public become aware of those maybe small changes to policy over time?
So the system that we use for our policy management on our side of it, there's a button that you click and it automatically puts two policies together and it highlights all the changes. That feature is not allowed, or doesn't work for the public. The public only gets to see the one policy, and that's not even an option for them. So I don't know why I don't know why they don't have that feature, but I can probably ask and try to figure that out. But I know that's not a feature for the public in the system that we have.
Okay, thank you. Something like that I think would be pretty helpful. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, and I think there's a way to put a policy up that is a first policy that is the following policies were changed this year on this date and time. So there's probably a workaround that would work so the public can go to that one spot to see the dates and times of changes. But we can talk about that offline. Ms. Bronga.
Thank you, Chair. I was wondering, I'm on page 6, number 4, body-worn camera footage may be released only in response to public records requests. I guess I'm assuming that there will always be a records request if it was a critical incident, but if nobody requests, then it won't be released, is one question I have. And then, so that was number 4 under the number 4 under E.
Go ahead, Ms. Gardner.
Thank you. So I'm looking at for E4 right now. The first part of that section says, except as provided below in section F, releasing body worn camera recordings. So there's a carve out. So there's body worn camera footage from all kinds of incidents because officers wear them all the time, every day. And so for most of it, you need a public records request to get it. However, in critical incidents, which are officer involved shootings, then the automatic 45-day, the release kicks in. So there's special status that acknowledges the public's interest in seeing the footage from the critical incidents, which are the officer involved shootings. But for, you had a traffic stop last Tuesday, if you want that footage, it won't automatically be released. Then you would need to file a records request.
Another question I had was, you're talking about the redaction, and it seems like it's going to be a pretty involved process. Do you know roughly the cost? Does the municipality have funding you're making a production of weaving these together? It sounds like it could be fairly costly, and I just wonder if you have any idea.
Well, the first video that we produced, as I mentioned, is almost 100 hours of staff time to do it. So since we're doing it in-house, we're eating the cost in staff time. But yeah, you're right. It takes some time.
And we've contemplated those costs municipal-wide, I don't know.
I think what I heard is some cost of doing business at this time, and then if it becomes substantive enough, we will contemplate it in the budget process.
Okay, and then that gets me to the next thing, and I'm sorry if it's somewhere that I haven't read yet, but this 14-day family viewing, any cost to the family for that?
No.
Two more people in the queue, and I have just a few minutes. I'm going to let Mr. Johnson go, and then Mr. Prissery, you can close out this conversation.
Great. I just want to, there's a few things I'll hit really quick. I know that we're going to go on to the proposed changes. I would just advocate at this point that we hold for the 45 days, as that's been the recommendation, and that's what the policy we've mirrored this after. I do want to hit a couple of things. I would suggest that we put in a very specific reporting and reviewing of the policy in the policy, so that the public and those of us know that it will be reviewed at some time period each year, every 6 months, whatever is the correct. And then there will be some form of reporting out on the how it's going. So I think that would set a lot. That would say a lot in terms of your efforts to try to be transparent around this. The other thing I'm wanting to just think about a little bit more is this internal controls. I think is the right way for me to say it when we're talking about producing them, when we're talking about redaction. There may be an administration that's not your administration that is that we're concerned that there are choices being made in that production and in that redaction that are trying to not necessarily share the whole story. So I'm wondering if we can contemplate some level of internal controls, like we would our financial controls, to ensure that there is we as the public can be sure that there are controls in place to ensure that we are receiving the true and whole story. Thanks.
Just a quick response on that. All of our policies are either reviewed annually or every 2 years, depending on what the policy is.
Okay.
This policy fits under the every 2 years, and that's the last sentence in the policy. Is this one's on a 2-year cycle.
Okay, have you any last comments before we pivot on the policy? My question is, you previously said it, with any changes that you might modify, is the intent was Monday to be in effect?
Depending upon how this conversation went, yes, Monday.
And so are you concluding now that it is Monday, or do you have any difference of opinion now?
Well, I do. We didn't really discuss this document, so I guess if there's follow-up questions based on the resolution that we didn't discuss.
Yeah. I think that folks asked the questions they wanted in the context that they wanted, as opposed to referring back to the resolution. So let's telegraph to the public. Is Monday the day?
Monday's going to be the day, unless I'm missing something.
I don't see a problem with Monday. I think it might be helpful if, before this work session is over, if we could get a clear sense of what specific changes the Assembly is proposing.
The work session is ending. We're out of time. And I think that the topics that I heard, I had a suggestion on that F4, which was clarify what footage is not going to be produced if it's duplicate and doesn't change the outcome, the perception. And I think one was possibly adding a section that says the policy will be reviewed maybe more frequently than every 2 years was, I think, the gist.
Yep.
And then I think, Ms. Brawley, you might have had a suggestion. Was there one in there?
Not so much in the policy. I think it was more just things I think
So
about.
I think those are the outcomes that I had heard. I don't think there were any more substantive. So I just want a clear and unequivocal statement. If it's Monday, it's Monday. If it's not, we'll hear a press release or some communication that says it's been delayed.
Monday it is.
Okay, thank you. Now, Mr. Molland, on the ordinance, which we just have a couple minutes for discussion, please run through the memo if you would.
Sure. Actually, so I'll make it even more simple and quick. The ordinance is pretty simple and straightforward. It does 3 things. On page 2, section 1, it says there shall be a body worn camera policy. I want to be very clear that it does not codify the policy other than to say there shall be a policy which shall be reviewed by the municipal attorney and the chief of police. And also that there in subsection B, that failure to adhere to the policy may be considered grounds for corrective action or discipline. The second thing that it does on page 3, section 2, is that it creates a definition for body worn camera system and digital multimedia evidence. And then going down to section 3, none of this is new. This is all of the language when the assembly put parameters around facial recognition technology is just being moved into a different section, so reorganized, but none of that language is actually changing.
Any questions for him on that? Okay, so I regret we didn't have more time to kind of go through it line by line, but I don't think there are substantive questions. So we have 2 minutes left. Ms. Bonga.
I was just wondering, would it be appropriate to put no cost to family for the viewing in that policy? It doesn't spell it out.
I was thinking it was implied, but
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, maybe a sentence in there. It's definitely no cost though.
I think it'd be helpful to have it spelled out so that
And
in the future we didn't.
that's fine. Ms. Bonga and I would offer that there are at least 2 projects looking at broadly the municipal records production policies and costs therein. And so there will be a broader conversation outside of the body worn camera police video conversation that will incorporate that as a subset, but we're going to be looking closely at that in the not too distant future.
Okay.
So,
Sure.
Mr.
Super good.
President.
Yeah, I actually think that the redaction summary will serve as a good internal control at this point, if that's a part of it that is there. So I just wanted to say that, and lastly, I just wanted to say thank you for bringing this forward. I don't know if the public is fully aware of this, but the assembly is not in a position to approve or not approve this policy. It's an internal policy, and so it's not a requirement for you to come forward and have this conversation with us. So I appreciate your willingness to do that and your willingness to hear us and hear the public and to modify the policy to the degree you can. And I look forward to working with you at the public safety and health meeting and continue to have conversations around this. So thanks for your time today.
That brings us to the end of this work session. So just, one more landmark on the conversation toward the production of body-worn camera footage for the public. We will be adjourning and convening again in 10 minutes for the monthly Food for Thought work session, or What's Good Anchorage. And today we'll be talking about biking in Anchorage and all the different groups that are engaged in that work. So I believe a parade of helmeted people might be arriving any minute. So thank you, everybody, and we're adjourned.